So after many years of reading this text over and over and preaching on it pretty much every year, it finally came to me what this story reminds me of. You may have heard of it. The TV show Survivor. For those of you who have not seen this popular reality television show, it's about a bunch of random, pretty crazy individuals who give up months of their lives to live somewhere in the middle of nowhere and try to be the last one to survive the game. And the show has a really cute tagline every year, but my favorite was a number of years ago, and it was called Outwit, Outlast, and Outplay. The show in general is about surviving, competing, accruing power, and most of all, winning. Each week in the show, they vote someone off the island, and strategically, in order to survive and stay week after week, and then hopefully win, players cheat, trick, deceive, manipulate in order to last the longest. This is the very game that the devil invites Jesus to play. In the few verses that take place in this story, Jesus refuses to acknowledge the lies that we live by. Ultimate competition, always winning, playing hard, attaining power and control. But the game of Jesus responds with an entirely new way to engage in the games. Instead of just trying to survive, Jesus invites us to thrive. In our story, we have the devil trying to be the winner, trying to kick Jesus off the island. But Jesus doesn't give in. He resists. And in his resistance, he wins the showdown. Jesus doesn't play the game with trickery or manipulation either. Rather, he stands above it and shows us how this journey of Jesus may be different than how we are used to functioning. Jesus makes life not about surviving, but the challenge to let go of the temptations and games of this world and to thrive in the freeing path of God. So let's consider for a moment our game of life here. We hope that we always will live the ways of Jesus, but mostly we are competitive and vicious as the best of them. Our world lives by the Survivor tagline: outwit, outplay, outlast. Most of us typically default in life to our anxious and coveting ways, no? Just go to a board meeting or any family gathering. It isn't just the politics and religion where we find the elbow swinging and behind your back whispering. We live like those on the Survivor show. We try to outplay our competitors and outwit our coworkers and outlast everyone. And for what? What do we actually win? Temptation, one commentator writes, comes to us in moments when we look at others and feel insecure about having enough. Temptation comes in judgments we make about strangers or friends whose choices we do not understand. Temptation rules us, making us able to look away from those in need and to live our lives unaffected by poverty, hunger, and disease. Temptation rages in moments when we allow our temper to define our lives, or when addiction to wealth, power, influence over others, vanity, or an inordinate need for control defines who we are. Temptation wins when we engage in the justification of little lies, of small sins. A racist joke, a questionable business practice for the greater good, a criticism of a spouse or friend when he or she is not around. Temptation wins when we get so caught up in the trappings of life that we lose sight of life itself. Temptations are all around us to outplay, compete, outlast, control, and win. Because we know how we play in the survivor game, and when we are aware of ourselves and how Jesus desires us to live something different, we can see how much we are surrounded by the temptation to live that game. In our story, we are shown by Jesus how not to get sucked into the world and the games the world plays. And when we hear the story of Jesus being tempting, it's like our excuse is, well, Jesus is God, so he can do it, and then we turn the page. Stay with me on this page for a little bit longer. Jesus teaches us the ways of God in the world that confront power, prestige, and control. Jesus has the power to resist those and so invites others to follow. Now, Jesus was in the wilderness for a very long time, longer than any of us could imagine. To be God is to be a little bit different than being human. We can model our lives after Jesus, but we will never be Jesus. That is one of the hardest, as well as the easiest things to figure out as we walk this journey of faith during the Lenten season. Our survivor mentality demands that we fight, outwit, outlast, and it's ingrained in how we think we are supposed to be. We are challenged by Jesus' example to take an entirely different road altogether. The journey of Lent is to realize that we can't do it, but to keep on trying anyway. The devil, finding Jesus starving and needy, says, hey, turn these stones right here into something you can eat if you're hungry. But Jesus responds, one does not live by bread alone. See, Jesus recognized and shows us that there are other things that feed us, feed our souls, our hearts, our minds, that are also important as our physical body, like loving our neighbors, prayer, worship, nurturing our understanding of faith in community, offering hospitality to the poor and the outcast. Jesus was not willing to sacrifice that in order to get some food. He's reminding us of how we must recognize that on God's island, in God's world, it isn't just about our physicalness, but it also matters about what we put into our souls. Jesus could do it. We could try a little more. The second temptation of Jesus is about trust, too. Jesus knew God would catch him if he fell from that pinnacle of the temple. He knew God would catch him. He didn't need to put God to the test. He wasn't just going to survive, though. He trusted God. This temptation is about learning to trust the truths that we already know about God, of God's care, of God's presence, of God's protection, that they all exist, and that God will follow through on the promises that God makes to us. Now, in that final temptation, the devil offers Jesus power and authority over all the kingdoms of the world. And again, Jesus says, no. He's committed only to God. He will serve God only. Even when given the opportunity to be in charge of everything and everyone, he says no. Now, this one is really impossible for us. And I don't mean to be so depressing about it, really. But in our lives, in our lifetime, we may have a few times when we are able to put God first. But I would say that is usually the exception, not the rule. I mean, take some of our meager Lenten practices, mine included. The idea is that we develop them to push us to knowing and experiencing more about God. Yet we have the audacity to call them sacrifices, when all they really are is doing or not doing something to better ourselves, but not necessarily our lives of faith. Jesus was in the wilderness when this story takes place. He'd already been there for 40 days. I've always thought of the wilderness as a time and a place that was hot and dry and parching air, desolate and lonely. In my study, though, of this motif in the Bible of wilderness, not only is it a dry and parched, desolate place, but it is also a place where many experience God's care and God's presence. Remember Hagar, who had a child with Abraham named Ishmael, and they were sent out into the wilderness. God took care of her. God brought her food and shelter and drink. Or remember the Israelites when they were traveling through the wilderness? They received manna. God guided them at night by light and during the day by a cloud. Throughout the scriptures, the wilderness is typically never known as being a place just to survive. People thrived there. So maybe, just maybe, Lent is more about the game of trusting God with our whole selves and learning to recognize the radical nature of the gospel that goes beyond just surviving in this place. Our world, as lonely and broken and difficult as it can be, is also the place where God desires for us to live fully, as God continually will provide for us, whether it be in presence or comfort, or perhaps even in restoration. Our time in this world is meant to be lived from a place of trust in God's goodness and care of us. Where we are in our lives demands the best of us, given that God can and will provide. So in this wilderness of Lent, maybe Jesus will show himself to us in unexpected places and in unexpected ways as we risk trusting God in new ways. Risk living with decisions that do allow God to be in control. Risk trusting that God does have a vision and purpose for this place and is taking us on a new adventure. When we turn to live in the wilderness with more trust, we will more eagerly engage in patience and in care, more exploring and engaging who we know God to be, and walking into this wilderness expecting to find God and embrace God's ways. Jesus, my friends, offers us an alternative way to live. But to follow, we must risk more. And we will most likely lose most of the time. Because the world plays by a different game, where winning and competition have center stage. Our Lord did end up on a cross for the way that he lived. The risk for us is to lose ourselves, that God might be glorified in all of the choices that we make. By watching Jesus in this story and the rest of the story throughout Lent, we will understand how Jesus does ultimately win. But for now, in this week, let's look for God in unexpected places and trust that Jesus will show up in the risk, in the sacrifice, and in our obedience.